How many of you in this room have achieved a safe manual handling routine, but looking back, feel its implementation fractured your relationship with your participant, the family, and support worker beyond recovery? I have, and the most memorable one or time it happened was a gentleman I went to assess about 10 years ago. He was born the same day as me, and of course, this made me have a slight connection with this client. We both started our lives on the same day, and how different his life with cerebral palsy and that of his parents was compared with me and my parents. His parents wanted a service to help them manage his care, and I was sent in as the manual handling advisor to assess for a safe service. I really, really wanted to give this family what they deserve and the help that they needed. And it ended up that I had to give the family some really bad news that they didn't want to hear about the way that the service would have to be done. It resulted in the man's father asking me to leave their home. I guess I decided that day that I never wanted that to happen again, both for the client and the family, but also for myself. And I decided that there must be another way. My name is Aideen Gallagher, and I've developed a educational program called Hoisted. It's a program that aims to provide therapists with the skills to efficiently and effectively prescribe hoists, managing the social, emotional, and physical considerations. Today, I'm going to talk about the social and emotional elements of manual handling in the context of the home environment. As well as identifying these elements, I will provide some samples of the solutions that, again, moving on from this incident, I found to be really effective in managing some of these challenges. I guess taking a lot from the negotiation literature. I want to start a conversation today, as I really think by not opening this box, we're missing so many opportunities right in front of us for making the implementation of some safe and efficient manual handling routines less traumatic on all parties involved, as well as making it a lot more time efficient. This diagram here is called a PEO model of occupational performance, and it's one that an occupational therapist would learn in university, but I think it's applicable to all disciplines. And what it basically says is the person interacts with the environment, to the things they do and the way they do them, and essentially it leads to what's in the middle there in that green little bit, which is occupational performance and participation, i.e. we mean success or failure. So within the person, there's a number of factors that lead to the person being effective. There's physiological, cognitive, spiritual, neurobehavioral, and psychological factors, as well as in the environment. There's lots of things within the environment that can lead to success or failure, which is the social support, the economic and social systems, the cultures and values in which we're working in, the built environment, and the natural environment. So if we were to modify this diagram very, very slightly and applied it to manual handling, again, the person interacts with the environment, the manual transfers they have to do, how they do them, and the result is a safe and efficient transfer. The really important thing is that this diagram assumes one person interacts with the environment, but manual handling isn't like that, is it? Manual handling requires two people, and it requires both the participant or the care receiver and also the caregiver. And when we introduce that idea of manual handling requiring two people, suddenly this beautiful diagram that's quite neat becomes a whole lot more complicated. What we have to, I guess the elephant in the room in relation to manual handling is we have to be aware of the fact that in manual handling, unpopular interventions may be inevitable. And when we are dealing with those unpopular interventions, we need to have a strategy for the management of those, the news about those unpopular interventions. So going back to that diagram in relation to the person interacting with the environment, we talked about a manual handling being a we activity. And so if we look at the person, there's normally three people that are normally involved in a manual handling routine. There can be the participant or the care receiver, there can be the family member, and there also can be the support worker. So let's look at the participant and the family member first, and a little bit about them, and then the idea of the support worker after that. So we're looking at the participant. A participant is going to strive for independence, and I can tell you I'll be one of those fighters myself. We have to remember that any intervention involving manual handling involves in some way, an acceptance that independence has not been achieved. In many cases, once manual handling assistance commences, the participant at times has to stop having choice, and they have to invite people into their lives in some of the most intimate parts of self-care. And again, that elephant in the room is that once we are engaging in manual handling routines, we're essentially in the business of giving bad news. People want to hold on to weight bearing at all costs. And at the manual handling conference just very recently in Fremantle, WA, I spoke to a physiotherapist called Jo from Tasmania. And she reminded me that every client that will want to walk sometimes to the detriment of every other skill. So as a parent, a marker of success for a child is when the child can walk. And we need to be cognizant about when we have to talk about taking that away, and the hope that that encapsulates, or what that involves. That's the hope that a parent has for their child, a hope that a daughter has for their mum or dad, a hope that a son has, a sister or a mother, and the hope that a person has for someone that they really care about. We know all these things in manual handling, and this is nothing new, but the question is, what do we do about it? And it's the lack of the acknowledgement of this that I think can lead to an increased amount of time that we have to spend at dealing with this. What's really interesting is that um, the idea of doing an assessment and not dealing with this, I think it can lead to a lot of hidden consequences, in my opinion. One participant of my workshop labelled this really nicely, the concept of assessment creep. When you finish an assessment and you continue to get call after call about this case, when it takes a significant amount of time post-assessment, has anyone ever experienced that? Some people would argue that client-centered practice is about being nice. Yes, it is, but I think there are so many more opportunities within client-centered practice if we take a chance to look at it. So now we've talked about the client, let's talk about that support worker. A study was done in 2007 on injuries of healthcare professionals in Canada, in British Columbia in Canada. The study found that nurses have 21.9 injuries per 100 full-time staff, yet care aides in the home can have 37 per 100 injuries for full-time staff. And I'd ask you, why do you think it's higher for care aides than nurses? Some of you might think it's less training. Some of it could be maybe lower socioeconomic status. And some of you might think it's less support. But a big part of that study was the fact that the care aides sometimes can have less control of their environment. So let's look at that environment and that social environment under which a caregiver is working. Care is usually provided in the client's home or the client's castle. And once the caregiver walks over the threshold of that door, it's the client's territory. If any of you have spent some time in another person's home as an individual for even over the weekend, you'll see the influence of culture on what you do, whether Whether we have a health and safety policy there or not, it's still the client's home. And just by that fact, the caregiver is suddenly in a really, really vulnerable position. Secondly, when a support worker comes to provide care for a client or a participant or a care receiver, the care receiver is completely dependent on that support worker, and the support worker must achieve an outcome. There is no half positioned in a chair. There's no half positioned on the bed. They need to get the outcome. They need to get them positioned correctly, and there's no grey area here. Whether there's a loss of client's function or the equipment doesn't meet the standard it's supposed to, the caregiver will always be required to fill those gaps, and this is where manual handling is occurring. So many of our policies, I guess, our procedures will give a caregiver in a family home a hazard report form. This is an avenue by which they can deal with any problems that present themselves in these clients' territory. I run manual handling trainings for caregivers, and I often ask them, again, once I've in some way gain their trust, how likely they are to report uh, um, or submit a hazard report form if they see a risk to themselves or themselves in the workplace. And what do you think they say? And I guess the answer they tell me is no. They're not likely to put in a hazard report form. And I'd ask if this is new information for you or something that you're finding in your workplace. And I guess, have you ever thought about why they don't put in this hazard report form? What caregivers are telling me, and again, this is anecdotal, I don't have any papers to back this up, but caregivers are telling me they're not putting in hazard report forms because they don't want to replace the manual handling risk with a stress risk, because a stress risk is worse. Dr. Peter O'Sullivan at the conference, the manual handling conference in Fremantle, on the last day identified that stress is a significant contributor to people with sustained pain after a back injury. So stress is essentially worse sometimes than the back injury and exacerbates it. So support workers can form a significant relationship with the participants they provide care for. It has been found to be a significantly stressful job when a support worker forms this positive relation with the client. It's a significantly stressful job when the support worker forms this positive relationship with the client. They don't want to rock this boat. One care worker talked about it almost becoming a cancer, that they submit this hazard report form, the relationship has never been the same since, and suddenly trust is gone and there's almost a cancer through that relationship with their client. And that is exceptionally stressful for a caregiver and for anybody. So really this hazard report form is like this, sometimes when we justify, this hazard report form, we talk about in terms of OHS reasons. And I'd ask you, how many of you listening today have asked to do something really innovative in your workplace and you're told for OHS reasons that you can't do that? How does that make you feel? I'd be asking what OHS reason, and help me understand what specifically OHS reason is that there. But this OHS card has been almost used so much that we don't trust it anymore, and it can just instill this massive amount of anger in people. And so a lot of and I feel this WHS card is almost so important, but we only should be using that as a very, very last alternative. And I guess I'd ask, why should we not be using this OHS card, and uh, why is that the case? So, and also bringing that back to that hazard report form. I feel that clients are misinterpreting these forms. They make assumptions, and this is where miscommunications happen all the time. So if you look at the behaviour of inputting the hazard report form, I want to introduce this model that was introduced to me by a lady called Anne Parker, who lectures in speech and language therapy in London. And I felt this model is extremely important in understanding behaviour and how it's interpreted. So let's just say the model talks about a behaviour and the person who elicits that behavior having a certain intention behind the behavior, but the person receiving or viewing that behavior interprets it in a certain way. We need to make sure that the intention behind the behavior and the way it's interpreted are exactly the same. If not, this is where miscommunications happen. So I'd ask how this hazard report form could be interpreted by the participant. So a hazard report form is put in, and the participant sees it as attack on them and their skills and their home. And this can be that underlying frustration that can bubble up under the surface of under the surface, and our initial psychological reaction when somebody threatens us is to defend ourselves, and hence we enter into this boxing ring of tension. And any of you who have ever entered a boxing ring with a colleague or a client, it is exceptionally hard to get out of that boxing ring, let alone repair that relationship and start making it productive again. So just to be clear, I'm not against hazard report forms, but I feel we are missing opportunities to make things easier on everyone involved by the way we engage with it and the way that we almost sell it. So what caregivers are telling me is that they're almost burying their head in the sand when there's a manual handling problem in the home, because they don't want this manual handling claim to be replaced with a stress claim.